Local programming on KRWG Public Media made possible in part by viewers like you. Thank you.
Hello and welcome to Fronteras, a Changing America. I'm Anthony Morneau. This week we have a well-known broadcast journalist joining us, Ray Suarez. He's joining us to share more about his new podcast. He is the host of Going for Broke with Ray Suarez, a new podcast from the Nation and the Economic Hardship Reporting Project on poverty in America. Ray Suarez is also a co-host of World Affairs from KQED and public radio stations across the country. Of course, you may also recognize him as his time serving with PBS NewsHour's chief national correspondent, and he is also the former host of NPR's Talk of the Nation. Please welcome Ray Suarez. Ray, thank you so much for joining us.
Anthony, a pleasure to be with you.
Now, I'd like to dive in and talk about your podcast. Congratulations on the podcast. One thing that really got me noticing this podcast was an interview you were doing. And you mentioned that you yourself were personally impacted by tough financial times. Was this one of the reasons why you wanted to really launch this podcast?
Well, I'm not a reporter who uses the word I in his work a lot. So it's not something that comes easily or comfortably to me to talk about myself. Just hasn't been what my career has been about. But as I was talking with the people at the Economic Hardship Reporting Project about a lot of the work they already had in-house, about downward mobility during the pandemic, about families and individuals being pushed to the edge by economic hard times, one of the producers said, we ought to do an episode about you. And it took me a little bit of getting used to this idea that I would tell my own story, because often enough, this kind of thing seems a little private. I had both financial and economic and work-life crises, and then a health crisis on top of it. And it was putting a pretty dark shadow over my late 50s and early 60s. And it makes a pretty compelling piece of the podcast series, so I guess it's worth it. But also to remind a lot of Americans that this is happening to all kinds of people in all kinds of places.
I'd like to dive into that a little bit more about what you experienced. You were working for Al Jazeera America, which went under at the time, and you were left without a job. Now, you're a well-known national broadcaster, a well-known broadcast journalist. Folks know you, so it may be surprising to members of our audience that you had trouble finding a job.
It was distressing, and it didn't dawn on me all at once that this was going to be hard. When Al Jazeera went under, I was very disappointed because I really believed that we were doing great work, putting terrific programs on the air. And if we had just been able to make it through the 2016 elections, we would have proven the value of the network to the overall American news diet. But the people who watch the money decided that keeping us on the air that long wasn't going to happen. We went out of business in the middle of the primary season, and I wasn't worried. A lot of places staff up during elections. I would catch on somewhere. I had a good resume, I had a decent reputation, a good track record, so I'll find work. I really wasn't worried. But then after a while, it began to dawn on me that this was not going to be easy, that looking for work at 59 and then turning 60 was actually going to make this much harder than I had ever believed it was going to be.
So what were some of the responses you were getting from folks when you're looking for work? What were some of the things they were saying to you? And do you think there was really more going on there and they were just not talking about, do you think your age was a factor with that?
My age. My age was a factor, certainly. Employment law says that they can't say to you, we're not going to hire you because you're too old. Equal employment law says that they can't really tell you exactly why, if that's really the reason why. So I kept getting these weird reactions. One general manager who was filling a host job for a nationally syndicated radio program took me to breakfast, told me how excited he was that I was interested in the job and how excited he was to talk to me further about it, and then wouldn't let me audition. When I got back to them after they filled the job without even talking to me, after that initial, "Oh, we're so happy that you're interested in this job," he gave me this, non-answer answer. "We were looking for a different sound." I said, "Well, the sound is something that can be changed. And if you tell me we want this, as a professional who's been talking into microphones to make a living for almost 40 years, I'll give you what you want." The idea that there is some inherent internal sound and I can only do one thing is kind of an insult to me, but there was more to why he wouldn't want to hire me. One station, which had severe troubles with a previous holder of the job, again, tried me out for the job. They hired a search committee to fill the job. The search committee chose me as the top candidate, and the general manager overruled the search committee and hired his 25 years younger choice. And in the news release announcing that, they gushed about how this person was a young mother. A young mother is something that I never could have been, even when I was younger, but a young parent is something that I'll never be able to be again. It began to dawn on me that of all the things that I could provide to an employer, one of them was simply not, he's young. I mean,
see.
I don't sound like a creaky old guy. I'm still a hale and energetic person, and certainly radio should make that matter even less. But I couldn't get a job anywhere, and I couldn't get anybody to level with me about why I was having so much trouble finding work. One place was very excited. "Oh, you're interested in the job?" I said, "Yes, I'll be in New York on this date. We can talk." "Oh, I can't see you on that date. Let's make another date." And then the person ghosted me for 6 weeks until they finally sent me another letter saying, "Oh, sorry, we just filled the job."
Wow.
That's,
I mean,
and again, it was a woman 25 years my junior. So what can I do?
That has to be surprising for a lot of our audience members who have watched you for so many years on public television and listened to you on public radio as well. But as you were experiencing this, you also came across news about your health. Would you be okay with sharing that with us about what you experienced?
Sure. I got a cancer diagnosis, and that was one of those moments where it really feels like the roof is coming in. Already, you're having this crisis where you can't find work, you can't get people to talk to you about work, you can't get people to level with you about what they're looking for. And then this on top of it was just, it was a big burden to carry through those years. And a funny thing, I didn't talk about it to anybody connected with the business in any way, because I was so afraid that if I was already having so much trouble finding work, if they thought I was sick on top of it, forget it. Now, it's also illegal not to hire somebody because of a health problem, but of course they would never admit that that is why they're doing it. Now that it's long enough in my rearview mirror, I'm allowing myself to talk about it publicly. But I had surgery and chemotherapy, and it was a tough time. But now it's over. I'm cancer-free, at least for now, and looking forward to lots more years of productive life. But those days, sitting on the couch, sort of chemoed out and not really sure whether you'd ever be able to work again, those were some tough times.
Well, we're certainly glad you're doing all right. And
Thanks.
it's your podcast. Wow, some powerful stories you're sharing with it. I want to ask you about one episode in particular, and that has to do with how you got to know one journalist who was experiencing homelessness and was unhoused and had trouble sleeping. And you really explored the ripple effects of what that can cause somebody who may be unhoused. Now, can you share a little bit about that episode with us?
I think people who have never experienced homelessness look at it externally as a problem with a very simple solution. get somebody under a roof over their head and they'll be fine. That the proximate problem is the fact that there's no place to sleep tonight. But in fact, once you enter the shelters, once you enter that system of finding a place to sleep for the night provided by various social service agencies and local governments, you have a more near-term problem. And that is getting a good night's sleep. And paradoxically, the kind of presence of mind and the kind of clear thinking you need to address your circumstances, get a job, get a roof over your head again, is made impossible by the fact that you're unraveling emotionally and physically from chronic sleeplessness. People who've never gone into the shelters for the night don't realize that they can be noisy, chaotic, and in some places even dangerous places where your few meager possessions can be stolen overnight. So you then get pushed out onto the sidewalk again in the morning, 6:30, 7, 7:15 in the morning. You're standing out on the sidewalk and basically told, well, go do something all day until we open up again at 8 o'clock tonight and lay out our cots and our mats. And Lori Yearwood, as we talked about how to angle her contribution to the series, we zeroed in on sleep because, everybody knows that being homeless is terrible. They can sense it even if they've never had anything like that in their lives. But I think a lot of people didn't realize just how hard it is to get a good night's sleep and how injurious that is to your eventually being able to work your way out of your predicament once you are 3 nights, 4 nights, 5 nights in a row getting 1 or 2 or 3 hours sleep. It's a very powerful episode, and I hope your viewers seek it out.
It was a powerful episode to listen to. I don't want to give away too much about it, but it seems like you asked the question with that about the systems that are in place to help people who are unhoused. Are they helping, or are they perhaps contributing to more problems?
Well, one interesting wrinkle in all of this is the pandemic, because the pandemic forced a lot of places that were providing a bed for the night to re-examine how homeless people were being housed. And if they were being put in, let's say, the floor of a school gymnasium or, an open space in an armory and just cots all put out close to each other, that was conditions that would make the spread of the coronavirus more possible. And they didn't want that to happen because these are people who already have a really hard time getting medical care in the first place. So the last thing you want is a junior epidemic running through the homeless population of your city. So a lot of counties, a lot of municipalities, a lot of not-for-profit agencies started to find ways to house their homeless separately, in a place with a door, in a place with a bed, a room with a bathroom, so that facilities weren't being shared. And not only did they keep down the infections, but they also found that people were, on the whole, healthier, more cooperative, more presence of mind, more willing to abide by the rules, but also take the kind of wraparound services in the form of social work, counseling, job counseling, benefits, Social Security, disability, the other things that the homeless are often provided in a scattershot and less reliable way. The pandemic time was really a better time for a lot of homeless people, which is a almost contradictory situation, but there we are. Right near my daughter's home on the Upper West Side in Manhattan, there's a hotel. Obviously, once New York City shut down because of the rapid spread of COVID, hotels were empty. The city rented a nearby hotel and filled it with homeless people. And a lot of people in the neighborhood complained, but it ended up not bringing disorder, not bringing chaos, not bringing troubles on the street. It was handled pretty well, pretty peacefully, and those people were kept alive and healthy until after the worst of the pandemic was over. So a lot of places are re-examining the design of their programs for people who have no place to live.
Now, you share so many personal stories with this podcast. One was what a grocery store worker was going through during the pandemic. We saw so many interviews with frontline workers working in the medical field, but a lot of folks may be curious about what are grocery store workers going through. I found it interesting that you're able to shine some light on that with the podcast. Can you share just a little bit about that?
A lot of people found themselves being declared essential, but then not being taken very good care of at the same time. They still had to go into work every day and be exposed at random to the public, a public that may be coming through the door already infected. We got a beautiful portrait of pandemic life in a supermarket from a writer who had aspired to be a college professor, was on the verge of living that dream, and then the academic job market blew up after the 08-09 recession. After a series of make-work jobs in the meantime, she ended up back in her hometown behind a cash register, checking people out in a large grocery store, but brought all her skills as an observer, brought all her skills as a writer to bear, and gives us a beautiful audio diary of what life is like, the stratification that happens in the world when everybody starts to be a little afraid of each other. Everybody still has to keep coming to work at the supermarket, and yet it's the customers who think they should be afraid of the workers. It was at points just simply beautifully told, dramatic, sad, sometimes infuriating. She talks about the repetitive nature of grocery store work, and certainly that's a part of it all the time. That doesn't change during the pandemic. But the way that people pulled away from each other did change, and they were being treated as almost pariahs at the same time as they were performing a really essential service. Hey, pal, how are you going to get your groceries if I don't stock shelves, if I don't take your money, if I don't bring your delivery out to the curb, if I don't bag your groceries? You know, in a big city, you weren't going to start a rooftop garden and get yourself through the pandemic by growing your own vegetables or raising your own cattle, for that matter. We needed each other. We needed to rely on each other. But a supermarket became a dramatic place to see how the pandemic world was affecting life in America.
Yeah, we've learned so much about how it's affected workers in places like supermarkets, workers who have challenges of their own and may not have the benefits that a lot of other employee workers have with paid time off or sick leave. Many challenges there, so we're looking forward to learning more about that. Personal stories are so powerful, and as you've been letting people know about this podcast with different interviews in the media, you've been sharing your own personal story, and I found it interesting to learn about what it was like for you breaking into the network news business in the 1970s, Puerto Rican living in New York. Can you share a little bit about what that was like, as a person of color, going through that time, listening to you talk about that? It may be something that a lot of folks may have no idea of what just that was, because during that time, network news was mostly filled with older white men.
Yeah. Well, when I chose this way of life, when I set before myself the ambition of doing this work for the rest of my adult life, I knew already that it was going to be hard, because it's hard work. It's very challenging, very competitive. It's a tough world. But then I knew also that added on to that would be the barriers and impediments that stood in the way of a workforce that was not at all diverse and resistant to diversifying at the same time. So I was in that vanguard generation. There were pioneers maybe a half a generation ahead of me, men and women that I could see on television and hear on the radio in New York in the 1960s, who were the only one, the only voice in their newsroom, the only person who understood 1 million Latinos living in New York City, and there's this one person in your newsroom morning editorial meeting who can explain to you what's going on in El Barrio. Well, I was not in that pioneer generation. I was just a little bit behind that when in number. we started to show up and bang on the front doors of newsrooms. And my first job as a copy boy in a network radio newsroom, as I looked out over this vast work floor, a sea of typewriters long before we saw computers, a sea of white guys in white shirts was basically the workforce. There were a few women who were in their own vanguard generation as well, but also in very small numbers. And so I had to fight to break through some of those barriers in radio and television. I just knew from the beginning that it wasn't going to be easy. So I don't get bitter about it. I just thought, look, this is the way it is. These are the battles I'm going to have to fight, and I'm going to go ahead and do it. It is satisfying to see, on one hand, things have gotten a lot better, and on the other hand, they aren't anywhere near where they need to be. In great big markets, in Dallas, in Chicago, in Los Angeles, in New York, it really is still a battle that shouldn't be as hard as it is, but there we are, all these years later. And a lot of newsrooms are still pretty resistant to hiring Latinos and putting them in prominent positions in the newsroom.
Yeah, I mean, you bring up an interesting point. I mean, that must have been very challenging. I know I experienced it myself as a new journalist of not having somebody who could be a mentor or somebody who already knew what it was like to go through that experiences. I mean, did you have anybody that you looked up to kind of help you out to, understand like what it was like to be a Latino in the news at that time?
Well, I would go to the annual meeting of the National Association of Hispanic Journalists, and through our sessions during the day and in barroom bull sessions at night, we could sort of unload all our anxieties and our frustrations. And I would get on a plane and go back to work feeling a little bit better about the world and about my place in it. I had nobody in the newsroom itself, no news director who took me under his wing, no more senior employee who would see in me a version of their younger selves, nothing like that. In fact, in some places I worked, I was seen as a threat, an Aravist, an interloper, somebody that was not adding something good and necessary and desirable to the newsroom, but the sign of things to come, and a sign of things to come that wasn't what they were looking for.
I mean, moving forward with this issue, do you have a lot of hope that things will get different? And I guess with this issue, we not only should be talking about journalists, but also managers in the news industry as well, and perhaps owners of the
Look,
industry.
there are starting to be more people at every level, but it's happening too slowly, and it's happening during an existential crisis in the news business. Think of how many newspapers have either cut themselves in half or cut their staffs by 75% or just gone to the graveyard or merged with another paper. This is not a business with a growing workforce. There are actually fewer full-time journalists in America than there were 20 years ago, yet there's so much more content, which means fewer people are doing more work and doing more contingent labor for more different employers. So the diversifying of a business is really hard when it's a shrinking workforce. You have to be really mindful, you have to be intentional about who you hire and what your workforce looks like for this week and next week, but also for next year and next decade, if you are trying to also manage downsizing at the same time as you're trying to introduce diversity. The math is really hard, and very few new hires, very few growing headcounts are the state of play in America's newsrooms. And in that situation, if you're a young Latino trying to break in, it's as hard as it ever was.
Now, we just have about a couple of minutes left, but I want to get back to the podcast and ask you a question about that. Now, you already talked earlier about how you yourself were affected by losing employment and going through tough financial times. With that experience and the work you're doing with this podcast, what has really come to light about challenges older Americans are facing right now when it comes to potentially being unemployed and falling on tough times?
The profile is a little different for men than it is for women. While it is true and while it's always been true that women earn less, just a fraction of the dollar that a man earns, they don't experience the same sort of precarity that men do in their late 50s and early 60s. Men start to lose jobs more often. It starts to get longer, the period that it takes to find the next job. You have that next job for a shorter tenure, and each succeeding job pays less money. In the case of women, the precarity comes from lower wages, not from an accelerating decline in job tenure and responsibility and wages, the way men experience. So yes, it is rough in the workplace. Getting old, the experience is a little different for men than it is for women. And men are still, even today, more often the sole or principal breadwinner in their household. So when they hit those skids in the late 50s and early 60s, it also upends their plans for retirement. It upends their contribution into savings plans. It upends their strategizing around bridging across with healthcare coverage until they're eligible for Medicare. It's a pretty dicey thing. You know, I started to lose work and I was out of work for a long time, years short of when I was eligible for Medicare. I'm still not eligible for Medicare. I'm buying my own insurance under the Affordable Care Act. All the time that we're rhapsodizing about gig work and the informal sector and being able to work 3 weeks and have a week off and all that stuff, that's all to the benefit of employers, not to employees. You can provide these other things for yourself: insurance, life insurance, health care, retirement savings. They all exist if you're self-employed. It's all just harder. And there's no employee match because there's no employer to match what you're contributing to your savings. And you're also paying the employer half of Social Security, self-employment tax, as you do gig work, bridging across until the end of your full-time working life. So it's a lot more rugged than they tell you when you're in your 40s and 50s.
Well, we look forward to learning more about the stories you're producing and this issue, of course. Ray Suarez is the host of the podcast Going for Broke with Ray Suarez, a new podcast from The Nation and the Economic Hardship Reporting Project. Ray, I want to thank you so much for taking the time to talk with us.
Thanks for inviting me. Check it out. Going for Broke.
And we want to thank you for joining us on another episode of Fronteras, a Changing America. I'm Anthony Moreno. We'll see you next time.